this is such a moving and powerful film about an individual and the psychological cost that he's bearing even today, what happened so many years ago. And it's also, I think, an important historical document, if you will, to record what really happened for posterity. And I'm wondering, with those two endpoints in mind, what were the objectives going into making this film?
The first objective, I met Frank in June of 2010 at a teaching conference that was done in Indianapolis, where Frank lives. The conference was run through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And before I had gotten into teaching, I had spent 15 years working in the film business. And I teach filmmaking classes and television production classes, and I was always looking for a project that I could bring into the classroom that could incorporate a bunch of different departments within our public school. There were over 200 current and former high school students that worked on this project. The project spanned 6 different departments within our high school and involved 10 faculty members within the high school. And to get to the posterity question, one of the major reasons why I wanted to do the film not only was for the educational value behind it, but when Frank was speaking to us, it was the first time ever in public he had mentioned the letter. He had never spoken about the letter before. His children didn't even know about the letter until after this film was made. The letter's since been donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is going to be a part of their permanent exhibit. But the major reason was, while Frank was talking to us, he spoke to us about 2 sets of grandkids that he had from his 2 sons. And at the time, they were both, I believe it was 6 and 4. And I had 2 children at home that were 6 and 4, and I hate math, and it doesn't take a genius to realize that when these children are old enough, to hear this story of their legacy of where they came from, Frank wasn't going to be around to tell it. So I wanted to document his story from his point of view so that someday, whatever the technology is, whether it be DVD or digital download or whatever, his grandchildren, and there are now 5, can one day hear the story of where their family came from, because the facts are facts. If he doesn't endure this and go through all of this happenstance, they don't exist. And they could hear it firsthand, right from the man who endured it. That was the...
Thankfully we didn't know this going into making the film, because it really would have added a whole other level of pressure. But after the film was completed, it had premiered, we got the DVDs printed. Frank had taken ill right before the premiere and couldn't attend, but he had seen the film prior to that. We sent the DVDs to him to give to his children, and then initiated a conversation with him about donating the letter to the museum. Both Sean and I do educational work with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and so we knew that the letter was a valuable artifact in history, and knew that really nothing like it existed in their collection. And so at one point, Sean called me and he said, "You're never going to believe this." And I'll never forget, I was sitting in a steakhouse parking lot in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, and I said, "What?" And he said, "His kids don't know about the letter. They haven't watched the movie yet." And I said, "What do you mean they don't know about the letter?" He said, "He's never told them about it." And when I asked him if they would mind if he was donating it to the museum, he said, "Yeah, they're not going to mind. They don't know it exists. They haven't watched the movie." And so then Sean said, "Well, how much of your story do they actually know?" And he said, "Only about 10%. And so we were so thankful at that point that we had done this so that his kids, grandkids, would hear the story from him instead of secondhand from people who really had not yet been told the story, because Frank didn't want to burden his sons with it. And then the third objective for the film was also to make a product, an educational film that teachers like ourselves could use in the classroom. Being public school teachers, we know what the budget situation is like, and we know that if we want to purchase a movie to use in our class, we have to go beg somebody for the money, even if the movie's only $25. And most educational films, the film companies think, oh, it's a school, they have money to spend, and they want $300. So we wanted to make a film that we could hand to teachers for free and say, This is a movie that we made with support of all these educational institutions, with the support of Holocaust scholars, and it's a tool that you can use in your classroom and you don't have to pay for it. And to date, we've distributed over 2,000 DVDs. Just this past week, 250 educators that were at conferences in the Holocaust Museum received copies. And so that was our third objective, and that's really now the driving force behind the work we're doing.
And everything that we take in through donations from the film, or if people make a $20 donation to the film, we give them a copy of the movie for free. 100% of those proceeds go right back into the educational outreach of this project, and we promise Frank that we will do this indefinitely until the money runs out. So no one up here is collecting a paycheck, and we're self-distributing this because the only way we're going to take on a distributor at this point is if they believe in this mission, that we set out from day one. Is anybody question?
Other questions?
No, let's open it up for questions out here in the audience. Back here, one of our filmmakers. A documentarian also, by the way. Oh, she's a documentarian.
Great.
Hi, thank you. There was a moment in the beginning where that was included, where you were putting on this microphone.
Yeah.
Obviously a purposeful choice.
Yeah.
Can you speak about that?
There is this whole underlying aspect of the old cliche, art imitating life. I wanted to put in aspects of filmmaking at that point in the film when we were getting him ready, to basically tell his story. We're pushing in, on the music notes. The music notes kind of carry the slates throughout the entire film. But there was this whole filmmaking aspect behind it. And I had about 30 seconds of footage of the Nazis when they were making their propaganda film, Hitler Gives the Jews a City. And this footage was just amazing. It was the Nazis shooting fake, stage shots of what life was like in Theresienstadt. And we had all this behind the scenes footage that we were going to incorporate. I thought that was the train for a section. That we were going to incorporate into the film. And when it turned out, we contacted the Bundesarchives over in Germany to find out what it would cost us to get that footage. And we made this entire film, the whole budget from start to finish, the production budget was $13,000. That is it, okay? They wanted to charge us, it was like $280 per second. So I had to make a decision. I mean, I can remember going to Jen and going to Zach, they're taking the whole filmmaking aspect out of our hands. I mean, we couldn't, scrape together without, I think it would have turned out to be like a quarter of our budget, and so that's where that aspect came from, and it was going to, tie into this whole other theme, that was going to run throughout the film, where you would see these Nazis making this film, and if they were doing like a dolly shot, we were going to cross-dissolve to a dolly shot of Frank, doing his sculpture. Kind of like this is what they're looking at kind of thing. But like I said, it didn't pan out in the end.
It seemed to pan out. It was just a very memorable moment in the beginning for me, and it didn't really need to be re-echoed. It was a very sort of a personal and vulnerable moment. So thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted it to be raw. Just very raw. I just wanted this man to sit in this chair, just telling his story. And he did that for 5.5 hours, and you got to see 97 minutes of it.
I thought the film was incredibly powerful, and
Thank you.
honestly, I would like to see it in theaters all over the country, but I'm not in the filmmaking business or production, but I hope it has an even wider distribution than schools. I do have a question, and I was really curious. There seemed like there were a lot of photographs of the family in their various stages, and who was taking those photographs? And who who had access to cameras and how did they save the film? I was amazed by that.
That was one of the things that drew Sean into the story. Both of us, like I said, we do a lot of work in Holocaust education, and we've heard dozens of survivors speak over the years, and all of their stories are memorable and important. And one of the things that separated Frank's story from so many other stories that we had heard was the photographs. When Frank was speaking, he kept showing slide after slide of his family, and you didn't have to imagine what his family looked like. I mean, I have survivor friends that have one photo of their mother and none of their father, or vice versa. And with Frank, you didn't have to imagine that. He had the pictures, and Sean said, you know, he asked him 2 questions when it was over, and the first question was, where did you get all those photographs? And here it turns out Kurt was an amateur photographer, as we mentioned in the film, and Anda, the housekeeper, when they were deported, she saved all of their photographs. She remained in their home, in their summer home, and she knew it was important to preserve those photographs, and so she did. There was actually also 8mm film footage that had been preserved, and when Kurt and Frank immigrated to America, they, you know, basically escaped communist Prague, and they smuggled in their suitcases photographs and these film reels. And when Kurt died, Frank was so angry that he couldn't bear to watch the moving footage of his parents laughing and happy before the war, that he actually threw the film footage in the dumpster in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, where he was living at the time.
I thought it was just terrific, really powerful. And Frank seemed like ideal. I mean, what a subject. He was so articulate and insightful, and I'm just curious, before you made the movie, did he talk freely about it? Apparently his kids didn't know the whole story. It's not like he was giving slideshows to people, so it's just a lucky find, huh?
When he walked into the room, I mean, I'll be candid, he was really, it was no more to me than a name on a piece of paper, you know, that was going to speak in this itinerary at this Holocaust conference. You know, there are survivors that come to the conferences, they speak. At this point, I had heard probably 24 of them. But it was at the point where he starts talking, he's like, I grew up in almost Czechoslovakia, and he's showing, here's Mom, I'm like, when are these pictures just gonna stop? And they did. I mean, he had hundreds of them. And the filmmaker in me just kind of took over. I took out this piece of paper and just started writing. And I mean, I could not write fast enough. I'm sitting here thinking, the music department in our high school was like nationally recognized. Like, we could get them to, you know, score this. Like, our tech department could do the key art. And I just kept feverishly writing. I still have those notes. And like I said, when it was all over, I asked him, I said, you know, where'd you get all your photos from? And it was kind of crazy because throughout this process with him, you know, not talking to his kids about it, or, you know, it not coming up, it reminded me of one of my favorite lines from the film, where he says to his father, or about his father when they were talking about the letter, I was afraid to ask, and he was afraid to tell me. You know, and I think that that's kind of the relationship that he had with his kids about the story. But while we were making the project, I'd spend hours with him in the garage while he was sanding that sculpture. And he said to me one time, he said, how long have we been working on this project? And at that point, we'd been working on it for 6 months. And he said, you know something, Sean? He said, I've told you more about my life and more about my story, he said, in the 6 months that I've known you, he said, that I've told some of my closest friends that I've known for over 30 years. And you know, I asked him the same thing when I had found out that his 2 sons didn't know about the letter. You know, I thought that they were going to be like really upset, you know, and when he told me that they had only known, you know, 10% of the story, like Jen said, I was so relieved that I did not have that information going into it, and by the time I found that out, we were done, you know, and the film was over. So there was definitely a kinship there with Frank, and you know, just his ability to open up, and I wasn't afraid, you know, to ask him questions, and I mean, he was very candid with me in how he answered those questions, and basically told his story.
Yeah, he had spoken to a middle school teacher. That was how she got him to come to this conference. He had spoken to her class about 3 times, like once a year for 3 years. And prior to that, the only other time he talked about it was he did a tape for the Shoah Foundation, which was started by Steven Spielberg after he did Schindler's List to preserve testimonies. But he did that in 1997, and it was very short. It was only about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and he didn't mention the letter in it or anything. And he said it was the first time he had shared his story, and the interviewer just didn't really pull it out of him. So really, I mean, less than a dozen times by the time we talked to him.
You know, the first short film showed a Holocaust survivor who had revenge in his mind and was really determined to end the life of the guard that he saw. Your film was a documentary of a survivor that didn't come across as again, revenge for what had happened to him and his family. The contrast between the two was amazing, and as is Frank, apparently. Did he, in your discussions with him, did he have any thoughts about the Nazis and what they had done during that period of time? It didn't come through from him. I'm told that he showed the revenge to get even, so to speak.
I think with Frank, and this is why I love this man so much. I mean, what you see is what you get. I mean, he will find, I think, the silver lining in the most dire of circumstances. Case in point, the lemon ice. You know, it's like you just went through the Holocaust, you're on an open car in the middle of winter, and some woman throws you sugar, and somebody else throws you lemon, and what do? You know, like, you don't get angry. You make lemon ice, and it's and to this day, you know, lemon ice is one of his favorite, you know, desserts, and that's just who Frank is. I mean, you can walk all over his house, and, you know, we did this numerous times, he would stop and tell me about, you know, the flashbacks and stuff that he would have and what would trigger it, and like he said, sometimes it happens to him 30 times a day, sometimes more. The simplest thing, like putting on your shoes in the wintertime, you know, triggers those memories. But Frank, he's you know, find the silver lining in a situation kind of guy, and I hope that you know comes through in the film.
You mentioned the Shoah Foundation and Dina, that character. I assume she's deceased, and was that just luck that? I mean, did Frank know that there was a tape of her?
Not exactly. That was probably, for me, and probably for Sean too, for us, that was one of the coolest things that happened during making the movie. I mean, so many really neat things happened. Anna's great nephew found us and came to the United States for the premiere, and other documents surfaced. But we were actually doing work with the Pennsylvania Holocaust Education Council, and we organized a conference that was held in Reading in the fall of 2010, so about 5 months after we started the project. And we brought to the conference a film about art and the Holocaust called As Seen Through These Eyes. And it was made by the woman who actually did Dina's Shoah interview, a woman by the name of Hillary Hellstein, who's from Los Angeles. And she had made this film, and in the process of making the film became very close to Dina. And Dina had passed away the year before, in August 2009. And so by this point, we had been out and we had interviewed Frank, and he told us about Dina and their connection and everything. And so knowing that Hillary knew Dina so well, we were sitting at dinner, and you know, we said to Hillary, did Dina ever mention Frank? And she said, no. She said, that name doesn't really sound familiar. She said, but you know, she knew so many people. And something made me say to her, well, what about Misha? And her eyes, her eyes lit up. And she said, oh, Misha. She said, yeah, she talked about him a lot during her Shoah interview. So we had a colleague who was teaching in Los Angeles, who was a fellow with the Shoah Foundation. He got us her testimony, which was about 6 hours long. And we started just going through segments of it between the next periods. And I'll never forget, I was sitting there and she just started like talking about him. And I called Sean and I said, you got to go to such and such minute, such and such second in this section of the tape. And at first it was just, you know, the part where she said, you know, come in the room, and she's, you know, talking about that. And then about halfway through the day of watching this, we got to the part where she mentioned the painting. And Frank didn't remember that. And to this day, we joke that we're going to go to Europe and find the missing Misha. Because of the 9 paintings that she did of the gypsies, 7 of them were recovered after the war. And they're currently in the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland. She tried to get them back, and there was a legal battle, and she was unsuccessful. It's interesting if you want to Google it. But the Misha painting never surfaced, to our knowledge. But we joke that we're going to go to Poland and take out ads, and has anyone seen this painting? She recreated it, and as seen through these eyes, there's a scene where she recreated some of the work that she had done in Auschwitz, and you see it on the wall, a sketch of it. And so that's how the student was able to recreate it.
Okay, we need to leave for one more question, because we have to get on to the next program, unfortunately.
I'm curious about how the screenplay was written. You haven't said a word about your part. Certainly, they did the research and knew the man, but how did you come up with the words?
It was a very interesting relationship between the 3 of us. Specifically because we all had our own roles, I would say. Mr. Gaston here, he's a filmmaker. Mrs. Goss, she's a historian, and I sort of came from it as a straight storyteller. I'm an English teacher at the high school, and so that's sort of the avenue in which I entered the project. And it was a wonderful collaboration because we all had our motives. And at each step of the game, we had to find out how we could be successful with our own personal jobs while also satisfying the needs of the other people at the same time. So after they conducted the interview with me, not with me, I was not the subject of the film. After they conducted the interview with Frank, they basically came to me with the 6-hour transcript of what Frank had said, which translated into like 116 pages of just Frank talking. And from there, I read it, and I tried to break it down into individual bites of information. Sometimes I would take a page of the transcript and I would literally cut it up into 10 different pieces. Or I might just take a page of transcript and cut it up into 2 pieces, or maybe I just took the whole page. And just to take every basic component, every common denominator, and sort of isolate it so that then you could go back and say, okay, now how does this translate into the story? How does the drama of the story unfold? Because if you just, if you ask someone to tell their life story and you give them 6 hours to do it, chances are they're not necessarily going to do it in the most chronological or dramatic fashion because they're doing it just off the top of their head. And so I'm trying to tell this story as someone who is almost as though it's not, as though it is fiction. That's sort of the mindset that I'm coming from and trying to find, the common themes and so forth that leads him from the beginning to the end. And then when we start to collaborate with my partners over here, we have Mr. Gaston, who's thinking very visually at the same time, and he knows what images we have, and he knows that this is a historical fact that is very relevant to this situation in the film and so forth. And so hopefully by the point in time when I assembled all of those little slips of paper, which literally covered the floor of my entire office, hopefully I had something with which we could then start to collaborate in each of their specialties as well, and sort of bring in those visuals and link them in with the narrative that I hopefully have concocted out of the little bits, and the history that's really driving the plot forward the entire time.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful discussion, and I do want to add too that if you want to continue the discussion with them, you're welcome to go down into the lobby and if they have time and ask some more questions, get to know them, get maybe a copy of the movie you had in here. Okay, so
If you'd like a copy of the film, we'll have it downstairs afterwards. We'll be more than happy to have you, become a member of the team and donate to the project and help us carry this mission forward.
And you can also check out our website. It's mishasview.com, and we're also on Facebook. And we are working to organize screenings around the country, so if you know people in other areas that would be interested in the film, let us know. Find us online, and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.